Hello and welcome back to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and this is the fourth video in the topic on the USA from 1918 to 41, covering Roosevelt and the New Deal from 1933 to 41. I'll be giving two features of everything listed in the specification, starting with the 100 days. So the first feature was that Roosevelt, who was a new president, wanted to restore economic activity. Roosevelt had taken over from Hoover, who had been renowned for not doing anything, hence the Hoovervilles full of homeless people, and he wanted to, as he called it, prime the pump, which meant that he wanted to help restore the US economy to what it had been before the Depression and make sure it was back up and running again. He wanted to use money in order to help this. So if he used a lot of money through a lot of different organisations that he set up, he could create jobs for more people in America, which would mean that then they had more money and so could spend more, and so the economy would eventually recover. One of the biggest problems in America at the time was the banks. They were still unstable after the Wall Street crash. Many banks were still closing, and if a bank was financially insecure, many people would rush and take their savings out of the bank, and that would just hasten the collapse of the bank. And so Roosevelt decided to try and stop this, and he closed all banks for 4 days in the first 100 days of his presidency, with an act of legislation called the Emergency Banking Act. All the banks were made to reconsider their finances. They were inspected, and only the ones which were financially secure were allowed to reopen. So this meant that people's confidence was put back into the banking system. So fewer people were now rushing to withdraw their savings from banks they thought were about to collapse, and this brought an end to the banking crisis. So it stopped lots of banks from closing, which was really bad for the economy. The second key feature is that he increased support in fireside chats. This is a nice and easy feature for the 100 days. So Roosevelt would record broadcasts, which he would broadcast via the radio to Americans across the country, and he would explain quite simply, in layman's terms, the new laws that he was setting out to the American people. Also, the alphabet agencies, we'll see more about them in the next few slides. They're called alphabet agencies because their names are like 3 letters long: AAA, CCC, TVA, as we'll look at. And these were just organisations that Roosevelt set up in order to help America recover. He did this 30 times in total, and because he was describing what he was doing, he was raising support for both himself and also for the New Deal amongst Americans, and he could encourage them to do different things. So he could encourage them to go and put their savings in a bank because he was saying that they were safe again, and this helped further stabilise the banks and also increase support for himself because it was seen that his policies were working. So now we're going to have a look at a load of different alphabet agencies, and we're going to begin with the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA for short. The first feature of this is that it was federally controlled. So there are two main types of government in the US. There's state governments, which control individual states, for example, Mississippi, Florida, and then there's the federal government. This is the government of all states in the USA, and they can give out laws that affect all states. So Roosevelt felt that southern states weren't doing enough for the poor. There were lots of poor people after the Great Depression. People had lost their jobs, they'd become homeless, they hadn't got jobs, and so the TVA was set up across 7 states, and it helped them to recover. So it was part of the New Deal plan to help redevelop the Tennessee Valley, which was a valley which spanned over 7 states, and this operation helped to create employment because you needed lots of people to do the jobs, and helped reduce the effects of the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl had been a devastating storm that had buried and destroyed lots and lots of farms. So the idea with this is that it would help regenerate some of the farms and reverse the effects of the Dust Bowl. So the second key feature is that it revived the economy by producing electricity. So what actually happened was 20 dams were built in the valley. So obviously to build these dams you needed builders and people to supervise it, so this created jobs. And because they built dams, it allowed the flooding in the area to be controlled, so fewer farms were flooded. Because they built dams, they also generated hydroelectricity for local farms, so it allowed them to have more productivity because they had access to electricity, and it helped to revive the economy, especially in those poorer states. The next one to look at then is policies for agriculture, which includes even more alphabet agencies. The first key feature is that Roosevelt stopped overproduction in order to increase prices. So the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, was set up, and they paid farmers to keep areas of land empty and limit the number of crops and animals that they kept. So there had been a problem in farming because lots of farmers had increased the amount of land they had during the economic boom of the 1920s. However, this meant that they were growing more crops, and there were a lot more crops on the market because loads of farmers were growing more crops, and this meant because there was more supply than demand that prices went down. And this was bad for farmers because they weren't earning as much money as they could for their crops, and therefore they weren't turning over a profit on their farms. So the AAA helped demand that farmers kill 6 million pigs overall. So this meant there were fewer pigs that were being sold, and so the prices for them went up. Same with wheat and cotton. There was less of it being grown, and therefore the prices went up a bit. This helped farmers to make a profit on their products, and so fewer farmers were struggling. The second key feature is that farmers were helped if they struggled with mortgages. So the Farm Credit Administration, the FCA, improved mortgage arrangements for a fifth of American farmers. So more farmers could now afford to pay their mortgages, so they helped to lower their prices, for example, or spread out over even longer. And so this meant that farmers were more likely to keep their land and to keep their jobs. They weren't going to be kicked off it, and this made sure that the number of farms and the number of farmers didn't decrease further because farms had started to shut down before this. The next one then is policies for industry. The first key feature is that businesses were encouraged to join the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. So the NRA was popular amongst the public. It helped liaise between workers and businesses in order to increase wages and working hours. And 2.3 million businesses took part in the NRA scheme. They displayed the Blue Eagle symbol wherever their business was located, which showed that they helped to improve conditions for workers, and so therefore more people were likely to go and support that business. A second key feature is that workers could join unions. So the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA, allowed workers to join unions, and 3.9 million were in a union by 1939. Being part of unions, workers could fight for better pay, better hours, better conditions, which helped them to earn more and improve the economy. They could also seek help from unions if they were in trouble with the business, so for legal matters. So this really helped workers. Policies for unemployment. Well, first feature is that Roosevelt provided a basic income for the unemployed. So the Federal Emergency Relief Act, FERA, gave $500 million to states in order to help the unemployed. So this meant that when people were between jobs, they were given money by the state, which allowed them to feed their family, to have a limited amount of money in order to make sure that their family survived still while they were looking for a job. A second key feature is that people were encouraged to return to work or get into work. So Roosevelt set up the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and this gave young men outdoor paid jobs, and 500,000 had joined it by 1935. So it allowed them to get their first job and therefore to progress up from that. So it gave them a starting point, and also meant that they did do stuff. It was low paid, but they were helping and they were constructing things. Same with the Public Works Administration, the PWA. This was given $3.3 billion to help build structures, public buildings, dams, things like that, which obviously, pushing it to the builders, it created jobs amongst for the unemployed. So that lot that we've seen just now was part of the first New Deal. So these were the first things that Roosevelt set up in order to help the US improve. Now, it had some significant effect. It did help the economy. Farmers recovered, banks recovered. However, it didn't go far enough. Therefore, the second New Deal was introduced shortly after this, again by Roosevelt, with more alphabet agencies, more policies, and things to look at. Now, I know the amount of alphabet agencies is completely overwhelming. There's loads of them. And there are some ones that are listed specifically in the specification so you need to know them, like the Works Progress Administration, like the Tennessee Valley Authority. And there are others that are indirectly mentioned. So when it said, for example, in the specification policies for unemployment, there are ones like the CCC, the PWA, that are involved in that you likely do need to know. But there's, you don't need to know Works Progress Administration. You can just call it WPA in essays. It's a well-known abbreviation. That's fine. Don't feel overwhelmed by them. Take it slowly and learn the basic ones, and then build up from that. But you don't need to know every single one that I'm listing here, and there are even more as well that were set up, but they're not all necessary. On to the Works Progress Administration then. The first key feature of this is that it provided work relief for the unemployed. So this was part of the second New Deal, obviously, and it was very, very similar to the PWA that we looked at on the previous slide. So it helped to employ Americans who had previously been unemployed. So the WPA spent $11 billion to employ 8 million Americans in short-term work. So it gave them income, it gave them experience, and therefore they could better find a job after that. And it helped families because they were giving people jobs. It allowed them a bit of money to help them through the winter. The second key feature is that it invested in a variety of projects. So the WPA supplied workers for manual construction projects, so buildings, especially ones of public importance, so roads, schools, hospitals, and organised training programmes for young people in order to help them gain skills they might need for their working life. It didn't just help buildings and things like that. It also helped the arts industry, which is something you might not expect from this, especially when they were trying to revitalise the economy. But it did help writers, for example. It gave women sewing lessons and teaching lessons. So it didn't just help buildings, it helped the education industry, it helped the creative industry. It had a widespread impact across America. The next thing to look at is the National Labour Relations Act. So the first key feature of this is that workers were entitled to join a union. So the National Labour Relations Act, which is also known as the Wagner Act, banned unions which were funded by companies. So previously businesses could set up their own unions that workers would join, and unions were meant to campaign for better wages or better conditions or better working environments at companies. But if the unions were owned or funded by the companies, the union wasn't going to be very, very effective. So this banned that. It also stopped companies firing workers specifically because they were part of a union. So it meant that you were safe in joining a union. As we saw before, union membership rose to 9 million, and this allowed factory workers and craftspeople to campaign for better pay and working hours. A second key feature is that protection was given to unions and workers. So the National Labour Relations Board supervised union negotiations. So if there was a negotiation between a union and a company for better pay, better wages, the NLRB was able to supervise these negotiations and support the unions. The Wagner Act also defended workers who were fired because they were part of unions. So 226 lawyers were hired as part of this in order to decrease unemployment and help families. So the lawyers would help the workers who had been fired because they were part of a union in order to get their job back, and therefore this meant that there were less unemployed people and there were fewer starving families. Moving on then to the Social Security Act. The first feature of this was that it created a federal pension system. So when it started, employees would pay 1% of their wages into a pension scheme, which would become accessible once they retired. And this later rose to 3%, so they were paying a bit more. And a tax was given on employers to make sure that they paid money in, they paid the tax, and then that money was put into the pension scheme of their employees. This was all paid back in retirement, and this increased the incentive to work. So if people began to work, they knew that they would get money back in retirement, which made sure that they wouldn't starve, that they could live comfortably and well. The second key feature of the Social Security Act was that it created unemployment insurance, and it also gave grants to help the unemployed. So employers who employed more than 8 people had to pay a tax, which the government then gave to families who had parents who were unemployed, and this allowed them to pay for food to feed their families. Matching grants were given by the federal government to that given by the state government for dependent children. So families which had children under the age of 18 were given money by the state in order to support the children, and the federal government gave an equal amount of money to these families whose parents were unemployed, and this helped 7,000 people, making sure that they too didn't starve and could live comfortably. Welfare for farmers. The first key feature of this is the Farm Security Administration, or the FSA, which helped farmers struggling for money. So the FSA helped rural people buy land for farming. So previously they might have worked as tenants on wealthy farms, but this meant that they could actually buy the land themselves, which meant that rather than giving money or crops to their landowner, they could keep it all for themselves. And it gave out $1 billion in loans by 1941 in order to buy land to resettle families, so to give them a bit of land where they could work and earn money on. The second key feature is that Roosevelt helped to increase prices. So the AAA continued to limit production of crops by taxing farmers who grew more products than they were allowed to, so this stopped overproduction and meant that prices went up. The government could also control the amount of produce from farms, so prices rose and farmers could make a profit, which helped after the Dust Bowl, which had annihilated lots of farms. So this ensured that farmers weren't just working at a loss, they were actually getting a profit for their crops. The first key feature of the Banking Act was that it created a board with financial powers. So a board of governors of the Federal Reserve System was created in 1935, and they were chosen by the president. And they had financial powers. So they could set interest rates, and this meant that powerful banks had less power. So it was thought that the powerful banks, by being able to set their own interest rates and change things, would destabilise themselves. So this set regulations across the industry, so made sure all banks had to comply, and this meant that they were less likely to repeat the Wall Street crash. So the second feature is that it strengthened the banking system. So central powers increased, and this meant that banks became more stable because they couldn't decide their own policies. There were experts who decided it for them, and this meant that no banks were closed in 1936. Previously, a lot had been closing because of the effects of the Wall Street crash, but it had finally stabilised. Interest could now be carefully monitored and controlled by the government, so another stock market crash was less likely to happen. It also meant that by increasing the interest rate, they could encourage people to save more, or by decreasing it, they could encourage people to spend more money. So now looking at rural electrification. The first key feature of this is that farmers could modernise their farms with loans. So there hadn't been a lot of electricity given to rural communities. It wasn't profitable for utility companies to set up links to rural communities. Only the major towns and cities had electricity at this time, and many farms and other villages in hard to access parts of states that were away from major cities and towns. They didn't have any electricity at all. And so the Electric Home and Farm Authority, the EHFA, gave loans to farms and other houses in rural communities in order to get them electrical appliances like cookers and fridges, which did cost a lot, but this meant that the lives of the people who lived there improved. They were able to store things in cool environments and to cook things easily and quickly. It also meant, because they had electricity, that farmers could use modern methods of farming. So, for example, electric brooders for chickens, which made farming quicker, cheaper, and more efficient. A second key feature is that the number of farms with electricity increased. So, as I mentioned, it wasn't profitable for utility companies to supply electricity to farms, and so in 1930 only 10% of farms had electricity. The Rural Electrification Administration, the RFA, gave loans so that utility companies would build more lines to connect electricity to farms, which meant that by 1945, 40% of farms had it. So it had increased massively, so farmers could use these modern methods of farming, and therefore it sped everything up. So finally, to sum everything up, Roosevelt's aims and the New Deal. Roosevelt had 3 aims for his New Deal. The first was recovery. He wanted America to recover from the New Deal. And we can see that farm income rose, so farmers were turning over a profit. Banks began to reopen, or at least stop shutting down, and unemployment fell by 3 million. So it can be seen that it was a success to some degree. But unemployment still wasn't down to the levels it was in 1929, which was as low as 3.2%, because it was 17.2% in 1939. That's still a huge increase, like 6 times that. So unemployment hadn't returned to the levels it was before. So America hadn't necessarily recovered that much. Farm income wasn't as high either as it had been before, and it actually wasn't until the Second World War, when America was shipping more of their produce over to Europe, because Europe didn't have as many farms, that farm income actually recovered to its levels. The second key aim was relief. So we can see that there was some relief. 35% of people received governmental relief. There was the Social Security Act, which gave unemployed people money. The WPA, which built schools and roads and provided jobs for unemployed people. But this varied from state to state, and some people still needed more money and houses to live in. Obviously, not everyone had jobs, so it wasn't entirely effective. And the third one was reform. So Roosevelt had introduced new policies. He had introduced the Social Security Act, which would give money to people who were unemployed. Unions had been set up and strengthened. There was rural electrification, financial regulation, as we've seen. However, there was still a large gap between the rich and poor. Wages for men and women still had a large gap between them. And black people and white people, again, there was lots of inequality across America still, so it hadn't been reformed entirely. The reason for this won't be a question A in paper 2, but it could well be a question B, or certainly a question C. To what extent was the New Deal effective? We can have a look at this. You can say Roosevelt wanted to recover, for America to recover, to provide relief, to reform American policy. And this is some of the stuff he did. He introduced the Social Security Act, he reformed banking, but there were still a lot of problems that remained. But for now, that is the All You Need notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and that was the 4th video on Roosevelt and the New Deal. It was a long one, but that's the entirety of the New Deal covered from 1933 to 41, and the next video will look at opposition to the New Deal, and that's much, much shorter. But thank you very much for watching this one, If you enjoyed, please do like and subscribe and comment to let me know. And thank you. Goodbye.